Well, good morning, everyone. We are so glad that you are with us. As you know by now, we are kicking off a brand new series today, and the title of the series is It's About Time. Probably a phrase that you have heard over the course of your life in many different ways, many different places, even many different times. And so today what I want to do is I just want to start with a question that I hope will at least get you thinking a little bit about the subject that we're going to be talking about for many of the next few weeks. And so here's the question to get us rolling. It's simple. Have you ever really thought about how you spend your time? Have you ever really thought about how much time you have? And have you ever really thought about how you spend the time of your life? Now, what's really interesting to me is that most of us, believe it or not, we spend our time in basically the exact same ways, at least for the vast majority of it, okay? So I was reading this week, and I was thinking about how much time we have over the course of our lives. And so let's just assume together that we all have about 80 years on planet Earth, okay? And here's why I chose 80. It's average lifespan, but here's the truth. I'm not sure I want to live much longer than 80, and I'm not sure I want to live much less than 80. Now, I may feel different when I'm 79, but that's the way I feel right now, okay? So let's just play with that number 80, okay? 80 years is the equivalent of 960 months or 29,000 days that you have to live on this earth. And so the question is, what do you do with all that time? Now, again, most of us spend it in basically the exact same ways. Out of the 960 months that we live on this earth, the average American spends 318 of those months asleep, or at least we're in bed tossing and turning and trying to go to sleep, okay? So automatically, we're already down from 960 to 642 months, or only 53 and a half years left to live. Now, we don't only spend a lot of time in bed trying to sleep or actually asleep, but we also spend a lot of our lives working. Now, obviously, this changes a little bit from person to person or from career to career, but the average American will spend somewhere around 160 months of their life working. That would be 24-hour days, 30 to 31 days a month for 160 straight months of your life that will be spent punching the clock. And when I read that, I thought, man, I really hope you like your job, okay? Because if not, you are spending massive amounts of time being miserable. That brings us down to only 482 months or just over 40 years left to live. So half your life is already gone just by sleeping and waking up and going to work. We spend on average about 72 months of our lives eating and drinking. And then we turn around and we spend 13 months of our lives on a toilet getting rid of everything that we've just consumed, okay? True story. Now, thankfully, that's not all in one solid 13-month stretch of time. You thought 2020 was a bad year? That would make for a really bad year, spread out over little increments. Now we're down to 397 months. Okay, somebody just caught that joke and laughed like 20 seconds too late. All right, down to 397 months, okay? Out of the 397 months that we have to live, the average person spends about 60 months of their lives just waiting. Now, when I read that, I thought, that seems a little too high for me. And then I thought about how much time I spend waiting on my wife, and I thought, actually, that number feels a little low to me, right? I'm sleeping with the dog tonight. All right. I thought about how much time we spend waiting on our spouse. I thought about how much time we spend waiting on hold on the phone, how much time we spend waiting at traffic lights or stuck in traffic. And of course, if you live in Ocean Springs, we spend a whole lot of time waiting on the train. Absolutely. I'm not the only one who feels the pain of the train, okay? Out of the remaining time that we have left, we spend another 48 months of our lives doing chores or projects around the house. That takes us down to 289 months left to live, or only about 24 years. Finally, I save this one for last because I know it's a really sensitive subject for all of our students out there right now. But students, you will spend somewhere around 43 straight months of your life sitting in a classroom preparing for life in the real world, which brings us all the way down to now only 246 months left to live, or barely over 20 years of the original 80 years that we thought we had to live. A fourth of your life is all you got left. All you have left to try to find what Solomon has been calling a meaningful life. And the sad reality is that most of us will spend just over 100 months of the remaining months of our lives watching TV, surfing the web, or scrolling through social media. And that brings us down to 146 months or 12 years and 2 months left to live on this earth, hoping to find a meaningful life rather than concluding like Solomon that all of life is meaningless. No wonder the psalmist said, "Teach us, Lord, to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." See, the reason that you need to number your days is because your days and my days, they have already been numbered. We have a limited amount of time on this earth, and how we use it really does matter. And so I go back to that initial question. Have you ever really thought about how you spend your time? In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, Solomon's going to talk a lot about the time that you have in your life, and he has a ton of wisdom that he wants to share on the subject. And this is how he starts in the opening verse of this chapter. He says this, short verse, but we're going to spend a lot of time on it today. He said, "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens." There is a time for everything, and there is a season for every activity under the heavens. Now, how many of you have ever heard the phrase, timing is everything? Let me see your hands. Come on, put them up. There we go. Almost everyone. A few of you living under a rock, you've never heard the phrase, but almost all of us have heard the phrase, timing is everything, and it is so true. In fact, this is really what Solomon is getting at in the opening verse of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Just think about it like this. The difference between a good joke and a bad joke often comes down to a person's delivery and their sense of timing, right? Have you ever heard someone tell a joke, the content was pretty good, but their delivery was terrible? It's because their timing was off, right? The difference between a great golf shot and a terrible golf shot can often come down to a person's sense of timing in their swing. But let me tell you something. Timing is far more important, and far more important issues that you deal with in your life. Timing is really, really important when you're dealing with other people, right? You never ask someone for a favor when they are stressed to the max, right? So when your teenager comes to you and says, "Dad, are you in a good mood or are you in a bad mood?" Right? What are they doing? They're assessing whether or not the timing is right. Should I ask for this really big favor, this thing that I really want, or a little extra time past my curfew, or not? And it's all based on timing. You should never go to your boss and ask for a raise when you're in the middle of a difficult season or the business is on the brink of bankruptcy, right? It's a matter of timing. You don't correct people who feel threatened by you, right? These are matters of timing. Timing is even important in cooking, right? You go throw a big, juicy cheeseburger on the grill, right? If you take that thing off too quick and you serve it up to somebody, it may be raw and it could make them sick. But if you leave it on for far too long, it becomes like this charcoal piece of brick and they could chip their tooth on it, right? Like we've all had that kind of burger. It's a sense of timing. Timing is important to your physical health. If there's a problem and you haven't seen your doctor for years, they may discover the problem, but they may discover it way too late. And there's very little that they can do to help you recover at that point in time. Timing is important in finances and in investments, right? Think about the houses that you buy and the stocks that you buy, right? If you want to make money on that house or those stocks, then it all comes down to timing. When did you buy? And when did you sell? And the timing of those purchases and liquidating those assets, it all comes down to a matter of timing, which determines, do I make money or do I lose money? But let me tell you something. Timing is important to your spiritual health as well. There is a time to work. There is a time to play. But there is also a time to be in church. There's a time to gather together to study the scriptures. There is a time to sing to God about the greatness of God. There is a time to gather with other believers, to process life, to talk about what's really going on, to encourage one another, and to pray for one another. And if you don't understand all of this, if you don't understand that timing is critical financially, it's critical relationally, it's critical vocationally, it's critical in all of these areas, then your life will be full of unnecessary problems, broken relationships, missed opportunities, and a feeling that life really was meaningless rather than meaningful. And that's why Solomon is going to spend so much time writing and talking about timing. That's why he starts this whole chapter by simply saying there really is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. You see, if you don't learn it from the Bible, then life experience will eventually teach you that there really is an appropriate time for everything under the heavens, but there is also an inappropriate time for everything under the heavens. One of the big keys to a life well lived is understanding what time it is. And so I want to say it like this today. You have to know what season you're in as well as what that season requires of you. Right? Our students, they know this as well as anyone right now. They had to go back to school this last week. Why did you have to go back to school this last week? Because you're in a new season, right? The summer season is over. The fall semester has begun. And if you don't change what you're doing because of the new season that you're in, then you'll end up falling behind very, very quickly. And it will make for a long, stressful, miserable semester, right? If you roll into school on Monday and you're still in summer mode or play mode and your teacher's trying to get you into work mode and study mode, if you don't make that transition, if you don't understand what season you're in and what that season requires of you, it will be a frustrating experience. It really does serve you well to know what season you're in and what that season requires. Even the Apostle Paul, New Testament author, follower of Jesus, he spoke about this reality in his own life. Listen to what he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. He said, when I was a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, I even talked like a child, but when I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. What's Paul saying? He's saying there's nothing wrong with acting like a child as long as you're a child. But there is something very wrong with acting like a child when you are a full-grown man or a full-grown woman. You have to know what season of life you are in and what that season requires of you. Now, no one knew this better than a man named Solomon. Because Solomon, the author of Ecclesiastes, He saw what it looked like for his family when his dad got this wrong. He heard the stories. In fact, it was very well documented, and Solomon probably read those documents over the course of his life. See, Solomon grew up with a dad who was haunted by the fact that he either didn't know what season he was in, or he didn't care what that season required of him. In fact, I want to show you the story today because it will paint this truth in a very clear but a very sad way. Now, for those of you who may not know, Solomon's dad was a guy named David, okay? A lot of people in his day believe that David was the greatest king Israel had ever known. In fact, you can probably talk to Jewish people today who still believe that King David is the greatest king that Israel has ever had throughout their history. And yet, right in the middle of his rule and reign, this really sad thing happened. His biographer, Samuel, tells us about it in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. Samuel's writing David's biography, and this is what he tells us. He says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Now, from the very beginning of this verse, Samuel is telling us that David is in a new season. He tells us right there in the text that it was spring, and then to clarify, he says, this is the time of the year when the kings would leave their palace and they would go off to war. And so all of the troops and the soldiers, they had been fighting the battles all winter long. It was a really difficult season for them, and the kings knew it. They knew the troops need a little encouragement from their commander and chief. And so the kings would leave the comforts of their palace, and they would go out and they would make rounds and visit all of the troops who were on the battlefield. Now, let me tell you something about King David that's really important for you to understand. David was not afraid of war. In fact, much earlier in his biography, we're told that the previous king of Israel was a man named Saul, and we're told that Saul killed thousands of people. But then we're told in contrast that David killed literally tens of thousands of people. David was a warrior. He was a cold-blooded killer on the battlefield. And so spring rolled around, which meant it's time for David to go out and to meet with the troops and thank the troops and pump the troops up. Maybe a guy like David would have even said, give me my sword. I want to fight with the troops and get one in for old time's sake. Like, I'm not as good as I once was, but I'm as good once as I ever was. And so David might have grabbed his sword and said, let's get it on, right? But the text tells us that David sent Joab in his place out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. For some reason, that spring, he decided not to go to war. The text tells us that David instead remained in Jerusalem. Now, at first, it doesn't even look like there's a problem with this. In fact, the text tells us that the army destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. So the author's telling us they're killing people and they are conquering kingdoms. It doesn't matter if David is there or not. But there is a problem. The problem's not out on the battlefield. The problem is back at the palace. And the problem surfaced because David either didn't know what season he was in, or he didn't care what that season required. Look at verses 2, 3, and 4. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of his palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. That man is saying to David, David, man, that's someone's daughter that you're looking at. That's someone's wife. David doesn't care. The text says, then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. Now, let me point out the obvious to you. If David had known what season he was in and what that season required of him, none of this would have ever happened. David would not have been hanging out at the palace looking for adventure. He would have been out on the battlefield experiencing real adventure. But because he didn't know what season he was in, or because he didn't care, David is hanging out at the palace like a peeping Tom, rather than being on the battlefield, being the warrior that God created him to be and the warrior that his people needed him to be. Or to use the words of my friend Rini, this one decision in David's life, it created a domino effect, right? One domino falls and a lot of other things start to fall as well. Look in verse 5. The text says, the woman conceived and she sent word to David saying, I'm pregnant. Listen to me. As you think about what you want to do with the time of your life, you need to remember that sin always has consequences. And now David gets to spend the time of his life either dealing with those consequences, or he gets to spend his time trying to cover it all up to avoid consequences. And so David says, I'm going to spend my time trying to cover up what I've done so that no one ever knows and so that I don't have to suffer these consequences. And so David sends word to the battlefield. And he says, there's a guy who's fighting for us. His name's Uriah. He's a Hittite. That's about all I know about him. I need you to send him back home ASAP. David thought her husband's going to come home. He's going to leave a battlefield where he's hanging out with a bunch of dirty, bloody, stinky, ugly old men. And he's going to roll back up in here and he's going to remember just how hot his wife is. He's going to hop into bed. They'll have sex. 9 months later, they'll have a baby. And no one will ever know what I've done. But David's plan doesn't work. Because Uriah comes home, but Uriah won't sleep with his wife because Uriah knew what time it was. Uriah said, it's not time to play. It's time for war. In fact, listen to what he said in verse 11. He said, Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents. My commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped out in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. So David's looking at him going, all right, then we're going to go to plan B. You won't go to your house to eat and drink? Then come over to my house. David invites him over to the palace. He serves him a big feast, and he keeps the wine flowing all night long, thinking to himself, if I can get this guy drunk, he won't be thinking clearly, and then he'll go back home and he'll sleep with his wife. But the story tells us that Uriah would not go back home. Instead, he chose to sleep on a mat outside his own home. Now we're into plan C. David feels like he doesn't have any other choices, and so David sends him back to the battlefield, and he has distinct orders. He says, I want you to put him on the front lines in the fiercest part of the battle, and when things get intense, I want you to withdraw the troops and don't let Uriah know about it. Leave him out there on his own to fight alone and to die alone. And that's exactly what happened. David's one little decision created a domino effect that caused a lot of other fallout in his life and in the lives of other people. David just stayed at home. And then he lusted after a woman from his rooftop. And then he committed adultery. Then he got her pregnant. And then he got her husband drunk. And then he had her husband killed. And now Solomon, David's own son, is writing, and he's saying, I'm telling you, man, if you want to know one of the big keys to a life well lived, you better know that there is a time for everything, and there is a season for every activity under the sun, and you better know what time it is, and you better not be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then Solomon says, let me elaborate and tell you what I mean. And he starts by saying there's a time to be born and there is a time to die. And there is a time for everything in between. In between those two bookends of your life, time to be born and a time to die. There's a time to grow up and there's a time to grow old. And you need to know what season you're in and what that season requires of you. When you are young, you need to know that that is a season in your life when it's time for you to listen. It is time for you to learn. This is not the season of your life when you need to show everyone how much you know. This is a time in your life where you need to grow in your knowledge and understanding by listening and learning from others. This is not the season in your life, young man, young woman, to command or demand respect from older people. This is a time in your life to actually show respect to other people. I mean, you think about how much you know at 15 or 20. Think about how much they know after being alive for 40, 50, or 60 years. It's a time to show respect and a time to learn. As you grow older in life, you get into your early 20s. This is a season in your life when you have to put your childish ways behind you, to use the words of the Apostle Paul. And you don't just put your childish ways behind you, but you have to embrace all that adulthood requires of you. You have to transition from expecting everyone else to take care of you to actually being capable of taking care of yourself, because very quickly you're going to be in a new season where you're not just having to take care of yourself, you're having to take care of others, and you're going to have to take care of them very, very well. See, a little bit later in life, you'll be a working adult, you will have a young family, and you will have to work hard to provide for your family. But you will have to work just as hard at being present with your family. And this is the great challenge that so many people struggle with in their life. I used to have a friend named Dave. Dave was on the executive leadership team at this place where I used to work. And Dave was a unique guy. Everyone on the executive leadership team was an empty nester, except for Dave. Dave was a lot younger than everyone else on the executive leadership team, and so Dave had small children at home. He had children who would be at home at 3 o'clock, waiting for dad to come home at 4 o'clock, at 5 o'clock. And if Dave wasn't careful, if he wasn't just working hard to be present with his family, they would have been waiting at 6 o'clock. They would have been waiting at 7 o'clock, maybe even later. See, Dave understood that he was in a different stage of life, a different season than all of his other colleagues. And so Dave worked hard, yes, to provide for his family, but he worked just as hard at being present with his family because he knew the season would pass. He knew that his kids would not be in the home forever, and he didn't want the season to pass and he have all kinds of regrets about not spending time with his children. Later in life, you'll become an empty nester, and eventually in your life, you'll start to think about retirement. Now, retirement's a tricky thing because it's all about timing, right? Like you don't want the money to run out while there's still time left on the clock, if you know what I'm saying, right? But let me point out something to you. It's really important that you ask the question, how much is really enough? See, there's this New Testament story about a man who has his barns and they are filled to the brink. And he looks at his barns and he says, you know what I think I'm going to do? I think I'm going to tear these barns down. I'm going to build even bigger barns. And then I'm going to fill those up. He's got more than he could ever use in his life. And yet he still wants more. And God comes to him and he says, you fool, that this very night your life will be demanded of you. And then who will get what you've accumulated for yourself? There is a time when you've got enough. But let me tell you something. Retirement doesn't just affect you. It affects everyone around you. It will affect your company. It will affect your coworkers. It'll even affect your customers. If you don't know what time it is, then you can create all kinds of problems around you, right? Well, we've all known people who have stayed on the job for way too long. That they weren't producing results anymore. They weren't as effective as they once were. Their heart wasn't in it. Their energy level had faded. But for some reason, and it's usually a financial reason, they were still holding on. And as a result, they may have benefited, but their team and their company suffered. John Maxwell has talked about the timing that it takes to leave a job or retire from a job. And he believes that leaving a job or retiring altogether is like running a relay race in the Olympics. He says that what you want to do is you want to pass the baton to the next person when you are in your peak stride or running at your top speed. But sadly, there are a lot of people who hold on way too long. And so they keep on running, and then they stop in complete exhaustion, and they hand the baton to someone else and say, here, you take it. I can't do this anymore. And at that point, it's too late. Your competitors already have a great advantage. The business has suffered. The team has suffered because we weren't thinking that there really is an appropriate time for this really important transition. When you retire, I want you to remember that may be the end of your career, but it is not the end of your impact. This is just a new season that requires new things from you. Why? Because there's far more to life than just what you see under the sun. If we've learned anything from Solomon and Ecclesiastes, we have learned that there is a lot more to life than just what you see under the sun. There is a God and there is eternity that is happening way beyond the sun. And if that's true, then this is a new season that requires new things of you. If that's not true, then retire, go play golf, go play bridge, go play shuffleboard until you die. But you and I both know there is a lot more to life than just that. And because of that, you need to spend these final years of your life investing in the next generation, serving as a group leader at places like Mosaic Church. You need to be investing and leaving a legacy, not just leaving the earth. Solomon's point in all of this is that from the beginning of your life to the very end of your life, you have to know what season you're in and what that season requires. Solomon goes on, he says there's a time to plant and a time to uproot. He's saying there's a time for you to start something new that may produce something great. And there's also a time in your life when you need to recognize that something is old and unfruitful. It's not producing anymore. And so you need to uproot it altogether. It's true in your work. It's true in your relationships with other people. You have to know what season you're in. Solomon says there's a time to kill and a time to heal. Did you catch that last part? There's a time to heal. I look at a lot of people that I care about in this church, and it's obvious that they're wounded. And so my question for you as your pastor is this: is there a wound in your life that needs to heal? See a lot of wounded people who aren't concerned with healing. They're just drinking away the pain. They're numbing away the pain with painkillers. They're jumping into another relationship far too quickly. They're looking for a rebound. They're pretending as though the wound doesn't exist. And because you haven't healed, people only see the wounded version of you. They never see the healthy version of you. You have to know what season you're in. And if you're in a season that requires healing, then you need to fill out the Connect card in the seat pocket in front of you. We have people that you can meet with. We have counselors that we can recommend and even help pay for. We have groups that you can be a part of, things like grief share, divorce care for kids. But for some of you, there is a time to heal, and that time is right now. Solomon goes on, verse 5, he says there's a time to scatter stones and there's a time to gather them together. Listen to me. There's a time to spend money and there is a time to save money. And yet most of us, we either see ourselves as spenders or savers. You can't think of it that way because Solomon is saying there's actually a time for both of these activities. So for all of you spenders out there in the world, you need to know there is a time to actually save money, okay? For all of you savers out there in the world, you need to know that there is a time to actually spend that money, to be generous, to share it with others, or to use Solomon's words, to scatter it around a little bit. In verse 6, he says there's a time to search and there's a time to give up the search. If you're single, there's a time for you to search for a spouse. But there may also be a time for you to give up the search and to focus your time and your energy instead on being the woman or the man that God created you to be, trusting that He can bring a spouse into your life whenever He wants. Maybe instead of always looking for the right person, this is a season where you work on becoming the right person. In the same verse, he adds there's a time to keep and a time to throw away. Again, if you're single, there's a time to keep a relationship and there's a time to throw away a relationship because it's toxic, because you're realizing that they're far too controlling, because they're pressuring you to do things that God has told you not to do. And if you don't know what season you're in and what that season requires of you, it will create a tremendous amount of pain in your life. In verse 7, he says there's a time to be silent and a time to speak. The New Testament tells us that we should be quick to listen and slow to speak. So it's probably wise for us to all spend a lot more time listening and a lot more time less talking. But there is a time for us to speak. In fact, Scripture tells us that we should speak the truth in love. We should speak words of encouragement. Scripture tells us that the tongue has the power of life in it. We should speak life into other people. We should speak the truth of the gospel to other people. We should speak the truth that Jesus has the ability to bring hope and forgiveness to people who have blown it, and we should share that with the world around us. Verse 8, he says, there's a time for love and a time for hate, a time for war and a time for peace. There is a time to love. And I'll say this, we should always love. We should even love difficult people because God loves difficult people, right? He puts up with you, right? You're difficult, I'm difficult, He puts up with me. But there's also a time to hate. There's a time to hate, not the things that we hate. There's a time to hate the things that God hates. Things like sin and injustice and evil things in our world. We need to understand that there's an appropriate time and a place for conflict. He said there is a time for war and a time for peace. Now, some of you out there, you're peacemakers. You can't stand conflict. You need to know there is a time for war. There's a time for you to set aside your immediate desire for peace, engage in a little bit of healthy conflict, resolve the conflict so that you can enjoy long-term peace. But there's also a time for peace. So for all of you who enjoy conflict, you're sick and you need help, okay? No, that's probably not what I should say. It's what I wanted to say. If you enjoy conflict, you need to know there is a time for peace. You need to learn to pick your battles because you are wearing people out, and they will not put up with it forever. There is a time for every activity under the sun. That there is a season for it all. And so let me ask you to think about 3 questions this coming week as you process this message. Question number 1, what season are you in right now? Talked about a lot of different seasons. Which one really grabbed you? Where did the Holy Spirit press in on you and go, man, you need to think about that? What season are you in right now? Question number 2, what does that season require of you? You may go, man, I don't think I can retire yet. That season may require you to retire, and it may require you to actually trust God with the future. I don't know. What season are you in? What does that season require of you? Number 3, what are the potential consequences of not knowing what season you're in or not acting on what that season requires? Finally, some of you are here today and you're thinking, I have terrible timing. I can look back on my life and I think to myself, man, I wish I had known this 10, 20, 30, 40, or 50 years ago. What do I do? If that's you, I would say you need to pray a very simple, honest, humble prayer before God. In fact, I want to ask all of us to stand and I want us to pray it together. As we close, I'll put the words up on the side screen. Let's just, in a spirit of prayer, just read it together with God. Let's start here. God, as much as I understand, I give my life to you. I'm asking you to become an even greater part of my life and help me. I've tried things my way, and quite frankly, it hasn't worked out. God, from this point forward, I surrender my life to you. I want to live your way according to your timing. I know I've messed up, but I believe Jesus can forgive me and give me a fresh start. I know that doesn't erase the consequences from my past mistakes, so I'm trusting you to help me as I try to move forward. God, help me to do the right thing in the right way with the right spirit at the right time. I'm putting all my trust in you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.